The topic of Christian morality, well, it's been making the headlines lately, especially since Vice President J.D. Vance, in discussing immigration and foreign policy, mentioned something called the ordo amoris, the ordered loves. Now, this concept goes back to St. Augustine and then also St. Thomas Aquinas, but it kicked off quite a backlash. And even folks like Pope Francis entered into the fray, wanting to talk about what this is and does it apply to governments? Does it apply to policy? Many pundits pointed instead of the Ordo Amoris to Jesus' Good Samaritan parable as a proper model of Christian morality and understanding that Christians should look to. But the entire conversation, I think, seems to be missing some fundamental aspects that nobody is really investigating. For this Kirkwood Center podcast, we'll delve into Christian morality. How should it or should it not inform government policy? And we want to look at some specific issues. That's coming up next. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Lenny Esposito. Glad to have you joining me today. And with me are a couple of our fellows from Kirkwood Center, Dr. Darren Guerra and Dr. Jacob Daneil. How are you, gentlemen?
And well, thanks for having me.
Great. Well, as I said in the intro, if you've been at all paying attention the last couple of weeks, quite a kerfuffle fell out of a pushback that people gave to Vice President J.D. Vance when they started saying that some of the governmental policies, especially policies on reflecting, say, immigration, undocumented workers, how you're treating those who are in the country illegally, and how we should then approach these kinds of issues. And is it even proper to take people who are obviously coming from disparate and difficult circumstances, trying to make a better life for themselves, so to speak, and, treat them in a way that just basically turns them around and pushes them back out? Is that showing Christian love? Now, to be fair, some of this is simply secularists pushing back on J.D. Vance's claim to be a follower of Jesus. So they're saying, aren't you being a bit of a hypocrite holding to an administrative position and an administrative policy that seems contrary to, say, Jesus' teachings of, let the poor and the burdened come unto me kind of thing. So first of all, I wanted to ask, what do you make of this idea that J.D. Vance pushes out that, governments have an idea of ordered love, right? This is what ordo amoris actually translates into. Who's familiar with ordo amoris and maybe wants to explain it a little bit more completely?
I'm sure we both have things to say. I don't mind kicking us off here, but I would tie it into, and I think this is where people get upset who haven't thought deeply about these things. And as you noted, Lenny, it does come out of like the Christian tradition, but I would go even further back to Genesis, right? It's really founded in the creation order. And there is an order in creation, the way God has created the universe, and the way we interact with God and interact socially is really rooted in the order that God created. And so our loves are ordered. God is at the top, right? And then after that, we have special obligations to our families, our wives, our children, our local community. I mean, that's really all he's getting at, is that there is an order to our loves, and we have special obligations to feed our children before we go across the world trying to feed other children. We have a special obligation to our wives, our local community. And if we're not meeting those obligations and we're off traipsing around the world trying to do other things, our loves are disordered. And God being at the top helps us order all those other loves as well. And there's more to say, but I'll just start there.
Let me say how refreshing it is that we are talking about some serious topics in politics now.
Yes.
Yeah.
it's
Good point. That who would have
it,
thought that we're talking about medieval theology because the vice president of the United States referenced it. I mean, that's just incredible by itself.
yeah. So it's both philosophical and theological in nature. The very term, which means ordering your loves. Definitely, as you mentioned, Saint Augustine is given the credit, in terms of its origin, as to he talks about disordered love, how you can place different loves in different orders, and that would determine how you actually um, uh, whether it comes out as good or it comes out as conflict between relationships. So, first of all, theologically speaking, we order things in relationship to God, as Darren you mentioned, and also in terms of moral life. So, ordering our love concerns with our relationship with God as well as our relationship with other fellow beings, and those relationship units determine the proximity in terms of how we engage with them. It's a beautiful concept, one that I think Catholics have talked more about, in my opinion, than as much as I see among the Protestants. I've not seen much being discussed. However, one of the books that C.S. Lewis wrote about, The Four Loves, lays it out really well in terms of how one should order their love. But one thing I want to really point out to is that when we talk about ordering our loves, we are talking about the relationship between certain units. For example, the unit within the family, the unit within the church, the local church, and the global church. Uh, so, one thing that's triggering much of the discussion today is because I believe we are missing out on that unit in this very discussion in politics as to what does it mean. What do we mean when we use the term nation, right? The unit of nation itself, because we are somehow not landing on a specific definition and a concrete definition of a nation with regards to like having the very discussion about the borders, for example, the illegal immigrants coming in, because we don't have the definition of nation with borders anymore. We're talking about more in terms of like how can we actually remove those borders and open it up for others. So I think in this discussion, for it to find some value in terms of this very idea of ordering our love, we have to recapture the idea of what this unit of nation means.
Well, and a couple of things. First, when Augustine talks about ordered love, it's not. I don't know that his necessary primary motivation is to say, put your loves in order. Ordered love for Augustine, I think, is proper love exercised in a proper context.
Yeah.
So he would say that we live disordered lives if we're not following after Christ. Our lives are not put in their proper order, and we're not ranking Jesus above all. And our loves should be reflective, they should be ordered. It's easy to have disordered loves, right? It's easy to love things that one shouldn't love. You can love vices, for example. So part of the concept of ordered love really is reflecting how God would understand and pull you in a specific responsible context. I think we see this clearly scripturally. For example, we don't have to go much beyond the 10 commandments, right? The first commandment is love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, have no other gods before me, this kind of thing. So the first thing, the highest love is God. But love your mother and your father is number 4. It's not, now it's don't covet your neighbor's wife, don't covet your neighbor's stuff. So that comes down at 9 or 10. And even in the Old Testament, the Jewish understanding of this, the Christian understanding has always been that there is a special rank in this. And Jesus himself mentioned that if you're not, kind to your parents, you're disobeying this commandment. That's significant. That's serious. That's more serious than just say being rude to a man on the street. We also have aspects of this even in the New Testament, other places like Galatians 6:10, right? Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, but especially to those who belong in the household of faith or the
Right.
family of believers. So here again, the Apostle Paul is saying, hey, yeah, we need to do good to everybody, but there's certain people that we need to take specific attention to because we have a personal responsibility to them. If you stand up before your friends and family and promise to love your wife in sickness and in health, you have committed yourself to her above other souls. And so if it's a question between your wife's insulin medicine and maybe giving a homeless person $5 so he can have a meal, you actually are more obligated to buy your wife's insulin medicine than you are to give that homeless person the $5 personally. You have it. It's same thing with a corporation, right? You have a fiduciary responsibility to your stockholders, for example. You can't just do whatever you want. The stockholders are in some ways bound to you, and you therefore have to deal with that. So that's what when I talk about ordered loves, I think that there's an important point in this here is to understand these loves in that way, in a way where it's ordered, rightly thinking about what love means, right?
Yeah, I think that's great, Lenny. And I want to connect to something that both you and Jacob had. But Jacob mentioned the concept of nation, and just as a political scientist, historically we've thought of collective groups of people. One and you think of excess and deficiency, the golden mean, right? That Aristotle pointed to, and so um, some would argue that an excess of organization you see in empire, right? Where you try to have empires who are ruling over many people groups, arguably many nations, that's an excess of political power and excess of organizational capacity. On the other end, you have a deficiency of kind of tribal familial identity as the highest kind of political organizing principle, right? And we do see the impacts of tribalism and the impacts of kind of ethnic or tribal rivalries, right? And the Bible does speak of nations. It talks of the Jewish nation and talks of Gentiles, and it has a certain respect for the natural ordering principle of people who gather as a nation. Now, modernity has modified that somewhat, but there is a biblical basis for nationhood and for nations. And then once you situate that in this order or mores, then there is a place for you to privilege, shall you say, your nation, or have a proper love or proper patriotism, right? And the virtue of justice, right? You owe your family a debt that you can never repay. They gave birth to you, and there's nothing you can do to repay that. So the Bible says you owe honor to your family. But the same token, your nation gives you owe your nation a debt that you can never fully repay. And that is just that you give to those who are owed. That's the definition of justice. And so you owe your nation a privileged status because they've provided so much for you in terms of a place to live, an ordered society, hopefully, good laws, good principles. You owe that, and you can't repay that fully. And so there's an issue of justice with you owing your nation, your family, your community certain obligations that you owe them in nature, in the created order, right?
Yeah.
And then one last thought on the created order. There is a tendency, I would say, in evangelicalism for people to kind of, I will just say it, that there's kind of an Anabaptist sensibility where the Old Testament created order, they demote it below or get rid of it overall, and all their ethics are kind of New Testament driven without any considerations for the Old Testament and the creation order that God did create. And Christ didn't come to do away with the law or do away with the creation order. He came to fulfill it. And so we need to factor that in. I think sometimes there is an Anabaptist tendency to just disregard the obligations we have either under the law or to the creation order. But no, Christ is fulfilling those, redeeming those, and so those still factor in, but he's doing something new.
I think in terms of nation, the very, I think we kind of see a model, what you're kind of touching on in the Bible too. God calls out Abraham to make him into a great nation, not for radical tribalism. It's to bless many other nations. That's the
Yeah.
whole idea of how could we concentrate and become a great nation so that we may bless other nations. I think it's not possible otherwise.
Yeah, and that was actually Israel's call. Well, their call was to be a witness and a light to the rest of the world, so to draw all nations unto the Lord. I've always been fascinated that in its inherent structure, because Jacob has 12 sons, you actually get a de facto federalism, right? You have 12 tribes, 12 areas of land, each have some independent autonomy, but together they have to be represented into the whole of Israel. So there's this, and that's really early. This is 1000 BC that we're talking about. So it's interesting that's the structure that God gives for the nation Israel, that he hopes will be kind of a model to the rest of the Gentile world as to how one can interact with God. So I do think that that's interesting. But it also leads me to a couple of questions. First of all, and I've forgotten who has first pointed this out, but I've always found it fascinating that people who simply don't believe the Bible at all are so quick to come to Christians and lecture them on what the Bible says and how they should be acting, which is, very, very evident in the responses that J.D. Vance received, because the first wave of resistance that he heard and was written up in all the papers weren't from believers per se. They were from the New York Times and they were from the talking heads on television. Now, there may have been a couple of Christians in there, but for the most part, a lot of folks they were talking have about as much to be interested in the Bible as, only an oddity that they see whenever they visit a hotel room. So that seems to be their fullest interaction. But it also leads me to another question. And are governments supposed to have the same level of culpability or approach ethics in the same way at all as individuals? Because we seem to be assuming that the parable of the Good Samaritan, let's say, that applies to governments as much as it applies to individuals. I don't know that that's actually true. I think governments are a fundamentally different entity. And so while individuals have this ordo amoris, does the ordo amoris, yes, you can order your ideas of protection and what's necessary, but what makes up governmental ethics as opposed to individual ethics? Is there a fundamental misunderstanding that those two things are actually differences of kind as opposed to differences of degree?
I would tend to think of them not necessarily as differences of kind. I think that God's created order, ethics is ethics, but there are different offices within God's ethical framework. And so government does have special duties, special obligations put on it. Now, that's not saying that government has to be intrinsically a Christian government necessarily, but government as a creation ordering has obligations that are just part of the natural world, part of the natural law, if you will say. And so in Romans 13, when Paul is kind of laying some of this out, like we are to be subject to the governing authorities. Christ says in Matthew that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And that's not a difference in kind necessarily, but it is a difference in office. Caesar has some legitimate authority. Governments are there to maintain order. As Romans 13 says, punish the good, I'm sorry, punish the evil and protect the good.
Yeah, that's the
Although
IRS you were
government,
talking about on the other one.
I was going to say governments too often do the reverse, right? So, but Romans 13 says, "Do what is good," right, and you will receive approval. Rulers don't hold terror for good conduct, right? That they punish the bad conduct. They wield the sword to punish the wickedness, right? And so that's part of the office, the role of government. But as I said, not a difference in kind, but a difference in the responsibilities. And so, I mean, governments aren't great at loving in the ways that individuals or families are, but it is a sort of love to respect God's created order and to fulfill its obligations the way it was meant to.
Yeah. What I would add to that is that in this discussion, there are two things that concerning authorities, right, of governance, when it comes to the question of authority and the jurisdiction. Like even with
Yeah.
Caesar, right? What's Caesar's jurisdiction? What's his authority? When we say render to Caesar, what is Caesar's? The question then arises: who decides what is it that needs to be rendered to Caesar? And even with Romans 13, when we talk about the deacon of God, the civil magistrate who wields the sword of justice, the question is, whose sword is he wielding? Who is the one who defines the jurisdiction within which the state should remain, or the civil magistrate should remain? I think that's a question. That's the main question behind the question, of the fact that the civil magistrate is required to do certain duties towards the citizens. So, unless and until we tackle that very question and recognize that, and the challenge is, why would someone who's not a Christian would accept the fact that that the sword belongs to God? That's where the tension is. But as Christians, as we understand it, I think we have a responsibility uh, towards informing the civil magistrate as to what that sword looks like and who ultimately owns that sword.
So let's talk about a couple of issues that are really important here, because
Yeah.
sometimes an action can seem to be virtuous, but it has a detrimental effect. For example, let's look at something like welfare policy, or no, let me use something that's a little bit less controversial. Let's talk about, say, Christians who and this is very common in the United States, where they will have summer short-term missions outreaches. So they'll take a group of folks at your church and say, this summer we're going to spend 2 weeks going to Haiti. We're going to help build a church. Have local guys there that are going to help build a church, and we're going to pass out some clothes that we're bringing along and things like that. These feel like virtuous entities. But if you talk with individuals who are, say, long-term missionaries, people who are embedded, and this happens in West African nations and other places as well. If you do this, what you find happens is that there are so many people doing short-term missions trips to Haiti that the guy who lives in Haiti, who wants to be a construction worker, can't get any work, because all the Christians are coming down there and building all the houses and building all the churches for free. So why in the world would I hire the general contractor, who's a local guy, to come in and do this? Why do I set up a retail shop when everybody's giving clothes away for free? Now, what happens is you're setting up a system of dependency. And although you mean well, you're actually helping to perpetuate the poverty, so that you can never have the individuals in Haiti establish their own economy and raise themselves out of it. This is how a lot of governmental programs work. Instead of the traditional understanding of Christians giving of themselves to hospital, uh, services, to giving personally out of their own largesse to support missionary efforts, they say, well, we're going to tax all of you people, and as a government, we are going to take your money and we will decide how it's charitably distributed. So I don't have to worry about feeding the woman on the street because she has the SNAP program and she has all these other things. But what that does is ultimately, doesn't that cripple her and make her now dependent upon the government, whereas she never has the opportunity to rise above it? So this is one of the tension points where even something, it's not that you're trying to be malicious. It's not that it's, feeding people isn't a good thing. Going on missions isn't a good thing. But sometimes there's fallout from that can be actually more detrimental than the other thing. And one of the biggest problems I've seen in the United States today is far, far fewer people give to some of these programs because they believe the government should do it, right? Oh, there were the wildfires that happened in Southern California. Of course, the federal government's going to come in and give relief to all these people. We're at the point now where it's a knee-jerk reaction. The government should have been the one to help all those folks. Where's the government at? Well, that's not been what traditionally had happened over the last few centuries. So I think that there's a big red flag there in assuming that the government can do the things in the way that individuals can do it, because the dynamics are different, right? You don't get to choose to give or not to give. Individually, the taxes come out. And so that's a big problem. And I think that robs us as individuals of something. It makes an artificial dependence upon the government, secondly. And thirdly, it doesn't allow you to discriminate. And everybody knows that private organizations are much more efficient, even even food to the poor and things like that, than the government ever would be. So it's actually you start to see a loss of stewardship in the whole thing as well. So I'd love to hear your response on those.
So I'll just add something to that. If you see that's why there's a push now. I see people talking about why the government should take away the 501c3 status from churches. Why are they getting tax exemption? Basic idea is that behind that, I believe, is that the state is recognizing that they should not take that which belongs to God.
Right.
The church should do its work within the jurisdiction that is set for the church, and the state should remain within its jurisdiction. It's in the blurring of those jurisdictions that's where the tension happens. And I think keeping those spheres separate and sovereign is the right way to go about it. At the same time, I do believe that while the state has the responsibility to deal with crime issues, that's the sword of justice, right? When crime happens, the state gets in, but we don't expect the state to get into the sin matters. The church has that role to wield the sword of the word. However, I do believe in this, though, right? Every sin is not a crime, but every crime is a sin. It's a moral issue. So church does have some role in terms of coming and informing the civil magistrates as to how to conduct itself. There's a moral duty there. That's why I believe. And the other challenge that we have is also church understands the fact that from a biblical standpoint that we have to approach within our jurisdiction to people in terms of fulfilling our duties towards them, in loving them, because the underlying idea behind that is that we all are created equal. So we cannot be tribal in that regard. Christians have the mandate to reach out to people regardless of the fact who they are and what they believe in when they are in need, and support them. I wonder if state would have that, unless, of course, if they had founders like here in America who were writing the Declaration claiming the truth, that we hold this truth to be self-evident, earlier sacred, right? That we all are created equal. It's coming from somewhere. Not all worldviews offer that kind of idea that would need a society to flourish. So I think church, I would say, have to come alongside informing and providing that basis that is necessary for flourishing.
Oh, that's great, Jacob. And man, there's a lot here. I have several things written down to mention, but maybe one thing in terms of stepping back. I mean, even this discussion about the role of the church and the state is a uniquely Christian idea, and America has a uniquely American way of speaking into that relationship. Let's go back to the ancient world. You had the notion of a sacral state, right? If you think of a Venn diagram, right, and these two circles, and you have the state and you have society. The state circle covered all of society, right? And political power and sacred religious power were fused. You worshiped the pharaoh, you worshiped Cyrus, right? Um, or in the Greek city states, the government determined what your religious duties were to Athena or Apollo or whoever the city's patron god was. So church and state were fused in the ancient world, right? After the incarnation, the birth, death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there's a new order in the world, and the church is born, right? And you fast forward, excuse me, you fast forward to Bishop Ambrose in Milan and Emperor Theodosius. And Theodosius is now a Christian emperor. And yet he's also a Roman emperor. And how do the Romans maintain power? They slaughter weak people. And there was an uprising in Thessalonica. It's a long story, but he sends in the Roman soldiers and they slaughter 7,000 women, children, and citizens, right? And that's just how Romans maintain power. Well, he comes back, and the bishop of he comes to take communion, and Bishop of Milan meets him at the door, and he puts his hand up. There's tons of great paintings about this episode.
Yeah, it's great.
And he says, "You cannot enter. You have blood on your hands, right?" And what would Julius Caesar have done? He would have chopped off Ambrose's head and marched into the church, right? But no, Theodosius actually says, "You're right." I mean, I don't know if he said those words, but he basically says, "You're right." And he respects the authority of the bishop of the church to impose the church's authority on him as the Roman emperor. And over a period of months, he does penance and he's restored and he's finally able to take communion. But you see a new principle at work here. The church has a role, a legitimate role that the state must respect. And so that principle is carried through to our tax issue that we're talking about in the 21st century. But that's the principle at stake. The church has an authority independent of the state. The state has to respect it. It cannot impose its authority on the church, and the power to tax is the power to destroy. Now, in through Christian Europe, you have Protestants and Catholics. What's the division of power between the church and state? And that wasn't always pretty, and there's always tussles. In America, for a lot of reasons that we probably don't have time to get into, we went the route of separating ecclesial authority from state authority. What was it going to be, the Baptists or the Congregationalists or the Anglicans or the Quakers? Right? Historically, America had religious diversity, and so that ecclesial question was already complex in America. And so historically, we've been bequeathed a situation where, yes, the state must respect church authority, but no church is going to dominate state authority, no single denomination, right? And so anyway, just a broad sweep of kind of just to give some context for people of kind of how we got where we were, where we are.
And what's important with this, though, is that there wasn't, and sometimes our atheist friends will make the mistake of thinking secular somehow means ollie oxen free. There's no moral guidelines whatsoever. That any every religion holds the same tacit weight morally, and that's just simply not true. There are reasons. We are talking about though the state doesn't bow to specific tacits of a specific faith, there are fundamental aspects that we as a culture assume, and those are Christian aspects, those are Western aspects. Muslim aspects, true to Muhammad, would be actually foreign. There's a reason why, say, female genital mutilation is still illegal, or polygamy is not legal in this country. There's aspects of that you can't marry a 9-year-old. All of these things play into a commonality, because if you lose that grounding, that aspect of faith informing our authority, then you've lost it all. And that's important. my concern is through this discussion that we've seen with people talking about that there seems to be a tacit assumption that government sets the standard for morality. And I don't know how many times you've heard that a lot of people will assume because it now is legal, therefore it is moral. So when all the marijuana laws passed for recreational marijuana, all of a sudden they go, well, I'm not breaking the law anymore, therefore I'm not sinning. And that's a mistake. And I tell people, you know what? Adultery is legal in this country. That doesn't mean you should do it. There's something to be said for morality that rises above the simple aspect of the law. And we have to be careful in that the church needs to inform the government much more than the government needs to inform the church. It usually is a one-way street.
And law is the legislation of morality. Government is the enforcer of the law, right? It needs to be enforced in some sense through the way of the law. It's not that the government is offering us laws or moral laws in terms of how we should conduct our life. And that's the distinction that is so much needed in this matter to really understand how we set those jurisdictions and not cross them.
Well, this gets to the fundamental issue of you're right, Jacob, of law. And what is the basic underpinning of law? Well, law is rooted in God's creation order. It's that here we get the term natural law. Law is rooted in nature. And every American should read Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It's a very accessible, very good distillation of the natural law tradition in a very specific American context. And King is saying, I want people to obey the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, but I also think that we should disobey the segregation laws. And he gives a very sophisticated, detailed analysis of that. And he quotes Augustine. He says, an unjust law is no law at all. Now, Augustine probably overstates it, but he's a very good rhetorician. The basic theory is that to the extent that law departs from the laws of nature and nature's God, then that part isn't law. But people shouldn't take from that just simply any law that they think is unjust is not a law completely. But there is a relationship between the natural law, God's creation order, and human laws. But there are people who say, no, human laws are just human laws. We make them up. Humans create the law. Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic says, justice or law is the rule of the strong, right? That's kind of the modern. Oliver Wendell Holmes in the early 19th century, American jurist, said that truth is the majority vote of the nation that can lick all others. And he basically says law is rooted in human will and human capacity. And so we just create the law. And so that, Lenny, that's where people are coming from, right? They're saying, well, governments make the laws and the laws are answerable to the people. But then they forget, as Jacob's pointed out, who are the people answerable to? They're all answerable to God, and the law is ultimately answerable to God. And that's the whole natural law tradition. And to tie this into religious liberty, you don't have human liberty without Christian liberty. You don't have human liberty without religious liberty. And so religious liberty is not some special pleading for the church. Religious liberty is the very basis of human liberty. It's the basis of any. Again, go back to the sacral state. Do you think the Pharaoh or Cyrus or whoever couldn't impose their will on the smallest person in society if they wanted to? Of course they could. There's nothing to stop them. But you fast forward to the Christian era. Now the church is saying, no, you cannot crush the least of these. You cannot crush the weak in society. You cannot discard babies in Rome like they're just trashed. You can't do that. And it's out of this Christian culture that evolves, rooted in religious liberty, rooted in a Christian anthropology, that we get societies where there's human flourishing. And what kind of secular kind of liberals would want is what we call the cut flower syndrome, right? They like human dignity. They like all the goods of kind of an open liberal society, but that open liberal society is rooted in Christianity, historically, ethically, theologically. You can't just cut the flowers off of the stem and they're going to die at some point. And they fail to realize that. You've got to keep them rooted in the history and the tradition that gave birth to them. And that is Christianity. And you have secularists like Tom Holland, not the actor, the British historian, even Richard Dawkins of all people, Marcelo Parra in Italy. There's these secular atheists who say, I'm a deep, deep atheist, but I want the goods of liberal society.
Right.
But they are also intellectual enough to realize I can't get these goods without having the roots of Christianity. And they're really in a tizzy. They don't know what to do because they don't believe in the truth of Christianity, but they realize that it produces these certain goods. And it's a whole package,
Yeah.
Richard. It's a whole package, Tom Holland. And it's fascinating to see. But anyways, just religious liberty is rooted in the Christian tradition, and it's the basis for any serious human rights, serious human liberty.
Okay. So, well, I think all that is really, really important. I think we have to understand that all really government does set a tone. I mean, it's not that our leaders can behave in any such way. We have to have them reflect certain values. That was true with ancient Israel, where God called out the leaders of Israel as under shepherds, and they were failing in allowing the pagan worship and things like that. And God understands that when you're put in a position of authority, when you're put in a position of prominence, that you have to be a model. And we hear that even in the New Testament, where teachers are hold to a stricter standard than the general public, because they do offer a model. One other thing I did want to note, that when, again, we are criticized as Christians for holding to certain positions that people elsewhere would think are unloving, I'm fascinated how two scriptures always seem to come to mind. One, of course, is the most commonly quoted passage in all of Scripture, and it's not John 3:16. It's Matthew 7:1. Judge not, lest ye be judged. That every non-believer knows that verse. But the other one is the parable of the Good Samaritan. How come you're not acting like the Good Samaritan? There are other teachings that Jesus had. And if we were going to apply this consistently, that all of the teachings that Jesus provides to individual interaction should also be applied to governmental interaction, how would these work out? For example, Matthew 5:29, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. How does the police force work with a Matthew 5:29 approach? Or how does the army function with a Matthew 5:29 approach? Or Romans 12:17, do not repay anyone for evil, right? I am the Lord, I will be judged. I will be the judge. Or how about this one, Matthew 5:32, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. How come our laws aren't reflecting that maxim? That means that no-fault divorce should immediately be banned. But nobody seems to be calling for the government to follow those precepts of Jesus. They only seem to be wanting you to do the Good Samaritan thing when it seems to suit them. So it feels like special pleading to me. And Darren, I'd love to hear some of your comments on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is special pleading. And one thing, I mean, there's a lot to mention there, but one thing, since we were talking about Romans 13, Romans 12 and Romans 13, obviously, numerically, it follows directly. But traditionally in Christian theology, Romans 12 is addressing individual responsibilities. Don't repay evil with evil. But that, Lenny, if you curse me out, I'm not to go after you, right? I'm supposed to let God, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But that's then Romans 13 kind of shifts gears and says, but there are responsibilities that government has, and government, if I go rob a liquor store, government should, that's not Lenny's responsibility.
Absolutely, it's a different office, and how it holds different. We have to weigh as you say, there are common moral precepts, but how they're executed has different ramifications, and therefore we have to weigh them differently.
And one way to put there is a debate within kind of evangelical circles, but Again, the Anabaptist tendency is to elevate nonviolence as the ethic of Jesus. Jesus is a nonviolent actor, and that severs Christian responsibility from government responsibility, and that's the wrong way to look at it. The traditional Christian teaching here is that they're not severed, that Christians should serve in the government, they should serve in the police and the military, and that they're fulfilling part of the creation order, creation mandate to serve in these institutions, and there shouldn't be, and the ethic of Christ is justice, not nonviolence. Nonviolence is underneath the ethic of justice,
Right.
but some in the evangelical world like to elevate the ethic of nonviolence above the ethic of justice, and I'm sure we could spin out lots of hypotheticals where that just doesn't hold. You can't achieve justice with a unbroken ethic of nonviolence, and so I think that muddles a lot of thought about government's responsibility and individual responsibility, and they try to impose an individual ethic onto the government, and the Bible, I think, clearly kind of separates that, as Jacob was mentioning, issues of jurisdiction and obligation. There are different; those are different based on whether government, community, church, family. God has ordered His world and His creation in a very kind of thoughtful and beautiful way, and we ought not to we should mess around with it. We should try to understand it.
I agree as well. Well, gentlemen, thank you for this stimulating discussion. I hope it's helped those who are watching or listening think a little bit more deeply, a little bit more circumspectly about the claims. And it's easy to say, J.D. Vance should choose the Good Samaritan morality over the Ordo Amoris, Jesus' words over those of some medieval philosopher. It's not that simple, and I think that that kind of caricature actually is itself a straw man that leads to a weakening of understanding who God is and how He does have us wish us to react. So I appreciate it. Any closing thoughts before we sign off?
And I would just add one note, just a side note, in terms of there's not one Christian way to do things, right? There is an idea of Christian liberty, and nations have a history. They have communities, and we are a certain nation ordered a certain way. And America is going to do things uniquely American, and that's within God's providence. It's okay to have uniquely American ways of doing things, and it's okay to have uniquely French ways of doing things, uniquely Chinese ways of doing things, but all of those unique cultural variances need to be ordered according to God's creative order, and not go outside of it. So just a note to, this isn't like a one size fits all that we're arguing for, but God has provided the framework for human flourishing, and Christianity has beautifully allowed that framework to flourish in many cultures and many historical periods, and it will, and it still can, if people will just recognize the source of the flourishing.
All right. So good to hear you. All right. Take care, guys, and we'll talk next time.
Thanks, Lenny.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.